Back, welcome back. This week we got some Carl Jung. Got my beard, philosophy beard. Not for this, but just so happens to be. Um, yeah, I don't know. I wanted to do a Jungian, a Jungian psychoanalysis of where we are politically. Um, I'm going to kind of assume that, if you're watching this, maybe you know a little bit about this. If you want to learn more about him, I very much suggest you do that. He's a very influential thinker, especially for us today, even though he's just, you know, this old white guy, but he's got a pretty cool pipe. Um, that he's his ideas are very much still relevant, and I very much suggest you dive into that. But today, I just kind of wanted to talk about how his analysis of the shadow self is very much, at least it's just, but what I've been thinking about this week. It's how it's reflected in our political system, and how his type of psychoanalysis says that can be overcome. We have a political system where 70% of people are completely dissatisfied with the two choices we have for president this year. But we still, looks like we're still going to have those two choices. How can that be? I think Carl Jung has a bit of an answer for us. Um, I think a big part of it, the shadow self, is very much tied to a study on the ego, right? So in the West, he very much targeted this as a product of Western individuality, our emphasis on the ego. And today we have, you know, mixed feelings about the word ego. Sometimes it's tied to, being too selfish or whatever. But really what he's talking about is the development of the Western mind, right? And where he saw it was, he was writing in the 20th century, and what he kind of saw. So the idea of ego for him is it's ego isn't something to be overcome, at least in the Western modality. He thinks that in other cultures, you should go about it differently. But there's no escaping that whether or not you yourself are Western, our political landscape, our political systems are very much a product of Western culture. So I think it's cool that he acknowledged that, but I think that it is important to also sit back and look at it through that framework. Um, so he thought that the ego isn't necessarily in the West, it's not necessarily meant to be overcome, but integrated, right? And our barriers for integration are really the aspects of ourself we don't like. And, growing up, we teach ourselves how to push those things down, and we try to avoid them and just separate ourselves from them completely. But Jung says that these aspects of ourself never go away. They're always there. So to completely mold yourself more fully, you have to integrate these parts of yourself and not be so judgmental towards them, but to look at them without so much judgment, to to accept to accept the things that you think shouldn't be a part of yourself. And he actually says that the purpose of this is a realization that we all have that, and that we all have these aspects of ourselves we don't like. And when we don't acknowledge that and see that within ourselves and see it within our neighbor, what we do is we create adversaries in the world, and we project that deep part of ourselves. I'll just go here, the shadow self. We project it onto others, and I think that this is just I, I don't want to get so much into the nitty gritty of it, but I think it's just such a good metaphor for where we are politically. Um, so much of our conversations they happen in like in a vacuum, and when you're in this vacuum, you just kind of get this idea that um, you know, at least subconsciously, you're telling yourself that this is, the right thing to do. And when you come into contact with a different vacuum, you don't really see it as human. You see it as, how can that even be possible that somebody thinks that about the world? And in the same sense that, psychology is applied to the self, Jung also applies it to the outer world. So us collectively, we also operate through the framework of this. And if we're not, and the idea on the individual basis is that you get to a point of integration by accepting these parts of yourself, and that leads to peace. Because before that, you kind of see this world, having this part of yourself that you're pushing down forces you to see the world as good and bad. It creates these kind of binary distinctions. So, you know, good and bad, black and white, right and wrong become very firm. And you list these things. But when you understand that you have the capacity for everything, you have the capacity for all these different things. You understand that what happens is you can kind of accept, you can accept yourself where you are, and you can there opens up a third way of being, and it creates this sort of peace. And I think it's the same thing politically. Like when we don't when we don't really try to put ourselves in the shoes of those we disagree with, what happens is we don't really understand them. So we don't see them as a part of ourselves. So we don't ever have an understanding or reason to try and understand them. So the reason that we have 70% of people dissatisfied with the election, with the choices, but we're still going to have that choice, is because we feel dissatisfaction, but even more strongly, we feel animosity towards the other, right? We have this feeling of we're disappointed in the system, but more, even stronger than that disappointment is our fear of, well, but that side's really bad, and so we have to do everything we can to stop it. What it does is it keeps us in this binary, right? When you're in this binary, there's no way of seeing another way out, right? So it's just we have this system that completely we get closer and closer. Our two choices are dissatisfaction or evil, right? So we're okay with dissatisfaction. And you might say, well, those are the two options. But what Jung says is that as it is for the self, you can't really find the third option until you integrate that which you deem to be evil or whatever within yourself as a part of you. Doesn't mean that you can't debate it or rationalize against it. That's very necessary. You should. But the potentiality, if you don't accept that, then you do get stuck in this binary. But what he says about integrating the egos, it's this beautiful thing, and it's this thing that people in the West have to do. Eventually, it's kind of the way in which our consciousness is moving. We're kind of sick of feeling shame and guilt, and we understand the idea of give to those in need and help those least among us and everything like that. But we don't see those things within ourself, and that's where he sees the Western consciousness right now, is trying to grapple with, well, how do I accept those things within myself? And the idea is that when you do that, it no longer becomes a binary. And he said a third door opens, right? One that can only be found once you're at that place. And I think we're almost there politically. Like we're caught in this binary, but we're just like, well, but what other choice do we have? Well, maybe those are the only two choices, because it's all we'll let ourselves see. We haven't we haven't placed enough, we haven't come to terms enough with ourselves to find peace in the fact that this is where the world is right now, and just accept that it's part of the natural process. Everything that came before us, you know, was it's cause and effect, and we're just here, and that's just the reality of where it is. When you can kind of find that peace, he says, that's when you can see another door. And so it might seem right now that that's it. Those are the options that we have. But I think there's really something to the idea of placing faith in letting go of that which we despise about others, and then at the same time, what we despise about ourselves, because I think those two are one and the same. And only by letting go of that can we kind of open a new door. And I think that this does happen on the individual level. I think it's part of our psychological development. So I think it can definitely happen on a larger level too. It might not seem, but you're like, well, what are the odds of everybody, doing that at the same time? Well, there is a kind of connection here. At least if you want to stick with Jung's psychology, he thinks there's very much a connection between our inner selves and the external world, because we have the same um, layout within our minds. So I don't know. I don't know. This was such a complicated one. I don't even know how much sense it made, but I I incentivize people to think deeply. If you're going to engage politically in any way, shape, or form, I incentivize you to look at least an inch deeper than pretty much anything that's, I don't know, pretty much most of what's out there. I think we get caught up in the details and the analysis of why they're right, these people are wrong and the evil and the threat to democracy, that this, yada, 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 come on. But what we don't see is how that which we spend our whole day criticizing is actually very much a part of ourselves. And until we come to terms with that, there's no way of getting past it. That's just Carl Jung. I don't know. Let me know what you think. And I hope you all have a great weekend.